Welcome to this final panel of the day. Now we are going to share information about a thematic network that is part of the chakra system in Aapresid. I'm the general coordinator of the project, and today I'm here to moderate this panel with Fernando and Leandro. The network, the core network of the south of Buenos Aires, is a thematic network within the chakras system to respond to demands of the crop in the region in the south of Buenos Aires. It covers the southeast and the southwest of the region. The idea is to share the results of the network after several campaigns since 2018. We've been generating information with this project, and the thematic networks, not only this one, but the 10 thematic networks that are part of the program, have annual publications that you can find in the web page of Aapresid. I invite you to visit the space and have access to the information. And they are made up of 3 essential parts that we try to represent in this panel. Producers and technicians, on the one hand, that carry out the field tests using the producers' technology, then the specialists in the topic, like Fernando also, he's the technical coordinator of the network, and the companies that provide resources to carry out the projects of the program. So thank you to all those that participate in the project. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the speakers. Fernando Ross, he's an agricultural engineer, graduated from the National University of La Plata. He has a master's degree in crop physiology and nutrition from the National University of Mar del Plata at the integrated unit of Balcarce, and also the technical coordinator of the core network of Southern Buenos Aires. Leandro Pontarolli is an agricultural engineer, graduate from the School of Agricultural Sciences of Balcarce, and he's currently an advisor for the Tandillia regional office of Aapresid. He's also a private consultant and advisor of the CREA Rauch Udakiola Group. With experience in public and private institutions, he works on integrating knowledge and field experiences to improve production systems in real contexts. So thank you so much for participating. And Leandro, you have the floor. Thank you, Lina. Welcome. I felt important with that introduction. It's truly a pleasure to be here and to share with Fernando what we do at the network. When Elina invited me to participate in this panel, what she shared with me, or what she proposed that I share with you, is what it means for us, for advisors mainly, for farmers that are part of the regional offices and advisors, companies, etc. We participate in a network, particularly in the corn network and late corn network. It's a very interesting topic for us. That's why very often we participated in these past years. And I always insist when we make the tours or organize visits to the tests, I always try to insist on the fact that the product that the networks have is the yield data of a hybrid. And that's the least important thing of all the process that implies having a network site in the fields of our partners, of our members. Why this is the least important thing, I mean the yield data, because that site, that point in the map that then we are going to show, the area that it covers, offers much more than a yield value per field. And what happens, you can see it in this graph, that is, generate the space of that container where each participant can contribute knowledge, experiences, as Marcelo mentioned in the president of Aapresid in his opening remarks, sharing errors. This is key, sharing errors, because many times we keep these errors to ourselves. We protect our prestige, but we've all done something wrong in the fields. And this is very important when we generate confidence and when we share those errors, because that's the way to grow and prevent them from happening again. as an advisor and as a producer. Of course, we value having tests in representative environments that can be extrapolated. This is tempting but dangerous, so we have to be careful of this extrapolation. Of course, comparing everything that the companies provide for the development of those tests, the adaptation, genetics, and of course, behind those tests, there's a previous work of people that have the knowledge to generate those protocols and carry them out. This is a map of the farming risk office that shows in different colors the productive capacity of the different regions. What surprised me when I saw this is how heterogeneous the southern area is in terms of environmental variability and differences in the productive capacity of the soils where we conduct the tests. So, I don't know, Lina asks us to put sites for the test network, and there are different situations of different lots of land in those regions, and then we have to compare everything, and then we tell him, well, get ready to compare this because we have a good product. It's a very diverse area. We don't have much time, but I'm not going to describe each area, but here you can see how heterogeneous this region is. The hilly environment in Tandilla and Ventania, they have different properties in terms of altimetry, the effective depth, where the roots can explore the soil, the shallow environment between the two hilly regions that is limited by the presence of the limestone, and also the basin that is very diverse, areas that are not so productive. But in all these different environmental situations, we have to generate uh, responses or information that can be replicated in different situations. I insist that, well, because that is relevant.
Esquema bastante básico que se lo he visto muchas veces a Fernando Andrés.
This is basic. We had seen this before from Fernando. Of course, we have to copy the good ones, and I thought this was relevant. In the scheme, we can see the, let's see, how can I put it? How reliable and applicable is the result of a test based on where it has been conducted and how it has been conducted? What varies is the control of experimental units. Of course, the control is very high when conditions are controlled. I mean, the exaggeration will be a lab with controlled environmental conditions, and at the other end, closer to the zero of the y-axis would be a situation in the field where we control almost no variable. So the tests of the network in the fields with machines, with heavy harvesters, with hoppers, well, isn't that area of the scheme? And then the tests in experimental stations controlled and done by researchers have a higher degree of accuracy. And I think this is important for us to consider what we ask from the result of a test when we see it, what we ask in terms of what we demand. We have to demand based on what the test is trying to represent. I mean, we cannot run tests in strips with the control they have in micro lots in an experimental environment. I was talking to Carolina Troglia, the coordinator of the sunflower network in the southeast, and she said that she mentions several qualities in micro lots, yield components, and it's very difficult to do that in strips. So by combining all these things I've been discussing, the information is accumulated from the macro to the micro environments, with different observation scales. And throughout this process, and this is what the scheme shows, how we plan a crop and how we go about it. Of course, everything has an area for improvement. The network does as well. I think it's good for us to have more sites in the region. I think that is good for the robustness of the data. FAIR is going to show that. I insist with what I mentioned before. The more we visit and the more we suggest and the workshops that we conduct, that makes the process more virtuous, and trying as much as possible, and this is aligned to what I said before, what to ask for, what type of tests. This should be integrated with other variables, trying to show more than yield, but always relying on what we are generating. And in terms of productive gaps, I included it at the end because we are working on it, and we could have some lines there to move forward. So the word bridge is very good for the network because that's what it does. It's a co-construction space that generates exchanges, getting together. There's something intangible there that appears when we get together to discuss. Well, the conference is an example of that. We have to insist on having quality meetings in the field. I know that we have lots of calls for meetings that are good presentations and good meetings organized, and in a way we've become very demanding in. But I think we have to make the effort and stay active in our participation and keep building together a richer approach in terms of everything we can do better. Sorry for interfering. Well, the most interesting questions come out in those meetings and the most challenging as well. So then we should see how we can answer that with new tests, new lines of work. And as to what's said, as to where we are located in that graph of Andrade, that I think was great, how can we supplement those two ends, micro lots of land or the extreme scientific rigor in terms of research, contrasted with the strips, and that sometimes they converge in very interesting points. Yeah, that's great. What you mentioned is good. And what you said about that graph, of course, we should do the whole scaffolding of the project with the strips. Well, that was based on these tests that are much more controlled, that are managed by science, INTA or other institutions or universities. But it's not one or the other. It's one and the other afterwards. But there has to be a very fluid symbiosis. I mean, the system is virtuous. How the tests work in the chakra system with specialists in the matter. And I also think that in order to make the most out of that information, both in strips and in micro lots, it's key first to know the environment, particularly in regions with such variability and heterogeneous conditions, how we recognize or characterize the environments to then make relevant decisions to be successful and as productive as possible. And also know what issues we want to solve, presenting the main problems or the main questions we want to answer. I think it's good also that you can send queries. There's a QR code that appears here. You can send your questions there so that we can answer them afterwards. And then you can also use the mic. So in a region where the map shows a high variability in soil, environment, and climate, it's key to characterize them and know how we want to respond, to then direct those tests or trials or experiences to generate information.
Hi, first of all, I would like to thank Aapresid for opening the doors to INTA for us to work together here and all the other lines where our path cross. As my colleague was saying, what's the important thing here in corn for it to have a good yield, right? So we need to obtain kilos. What are the tools then to develop a batch where we can have that yield and the necessary profitability? And here we have a lot of information in the net around all this. And we have several different environments, right? They are very heterogeneous. So we'll try to summarize that, but it's not easy. It's important for us to be able to obtain the maximum that we can from each environment. And that it's not done in only one way. And we are aware of that. We know that sometimes a proposal might not be the only feasible one. However, we need to understand the processes and try to be effective with them. So we'll talk about the environment, hybrids, and a little bit about management. What you see here is what my colleague showed, and these are all the environments from the net where we conducted the tests. And here we have a lot of work from people from the regional committees in Aapresid, those who were planting, harvesting, they're all so committed. And also, I would like to congratulate all of you because I went there and the tests are really high quality. And therefore, the data obtained from them makes sense. And given what Leo said, we can transfer many of these tests that were conducted with the machinery, the nutrition, the rotation of the producer, with the harvester of the contractor in the same conditions that you have for your lands. Well, that is a great value of the network. And we know that there are differences in environment and in the manages of these plots of land because not all farmers think the same way. Therefore, the complexity of the data is very rich, and it is interesting for us as researchers to try and validate what we see in these micro lots or plots of land so that we can transfer these into real scenarios. And this is the data that we're going to discuss now. These are 6 campaigns, 42 cities, 68 hybrids, and 1,740 plots that were harvested with the harvesters. And we are talking about late corn, right? And you know why then there's information missing. Let's talk about the density tests that were conducted in the network. And with hybrids, we compare these with density tests. And it is a little bit confusing when we see these because all the environments are below 6,000 kilos with no response to density, and above 30,000 plants, there's no strong issues about density. And for those tests or assays above 8,000 kilos, we are also confused with the density responses. It's not that we are confused. There's a lot of global information about the behavior of corn in terms of density. And there are things related to the reproductive plasticity, which is a niche in the southern area of Buenos Aires, and that minimizes the response to density. There we see levels of yield below 10,000 kilos, which is hard for them to respond to more than 50,000 plants. But if we go to other regions like our north or any part of the world, that is not happening, right? That happens because we are at an environmental niche. And I will show this very quickly. We are not going to discuss this further, but we are going back to the reproductive plasticity for hybrids. This is what happened in the 6 campaigns. What we have there are green dots that show the high yield tests. The size of the dot or circle is also referring to the sort of yield. The intermediate, which are in yellow, and the red circles or spots, the smallest. So when you see the campaign and there's nothing right next to it, well, there's a red dot there, and there we had a low yield. So this is the same diversity that we saw, as Leandro showed, at the soil level, accompanied by the weather and climate changes among the different regions. And to analyze this data, of course, this is very complex. The database is filled with variables. And the way in which you prepare the variables might impact the results. We try and be very organized so that results are accurate. And one of our variables to consider is the region. Here we have the campaign on the one hand and the region on the other. We have the southeast here, and look, comparing the central west region with the eastern region. Let's go to the southeast. What do we see here in the southeast? Large green circles and yellow circles, right? There are no red circles. That is the southeast of Buenos Aires, a very good area. We have the mountains or mounts in Tandilia, and of course there's cattle farming too, and the coastal area up to Tres Arroyos, all of that with a yield of over 7,000 kilos. And then we have the central western area, and there we have Tres Arroyos, and the area limited because of the limestone. And we see there that we have very dispersed data. The central west area is characterized by large green circles, medium yellow circles, and small red circles. So we are from 2,000 to 10,000 kilos. And of course, the environment is responsible here too. There are tests that were in deep soils in good years, some others that were conducted in not so good years. And then we have the southern area, or southwest, which is an area without green dots. We are between 2,000 and 7,000 kilos there. So that is the challenge of processing that entire database, so that we can obtain added value regarding the genotype behavior and the hybrid behavior, and also with regards to how you could be able to manage these plots better so that you can obtain the best results without falling to those low yields, and for things to have good results in these micro plots of lands. Also, the problem with this database is that it is imbalanced. And it's okay for this to be like that. But people are telling us, why don't you put a control hybrid to be there? And sometimes what's the problem with it? This control is the environmental index, the level of yield in our test. That is our best control, especially with this database without the right balance, because it's hard for us to include more hybrids to be assessed. And we are there because we know that companies want to know about new hybrids, and those hybrids of which we already have a lot of information of, I mean, that's fine. And sometimes happens that we have a hybrid with a lot of information, and you already know how it's going to work, and you're like, okay, next year it won't be there. So that's a constant challenge, and we need to work on this, and we need to try and overcome this. And this environmental index is one way to do so. So what happened when we analyze the entire database? What variables explain yield? The region variable accounts for 47% of the variations in yield. The next variable is the location, and that is included within the region. Those locations or sites within the region account for 21%. The next variable, which is very relevant, is hybrids, which accounts for 17% of the variations. So choosing a hybrid is very relevant. And even though 70% of the yield is coming from region, location, and the campaign, and in this database we do not give a lot of importance to the campaign, and I will explain why soon, the hybrid effect is very relevant too. So, why is it that the campaign is not so relevant? Well, because of this. We have here the yield according to each campaign for each region. And when we talk about the campaign, we see a balance here because we have some sites going down, some others going up, and that creates certain stability in the average yield throughout campaigns. And the piece of data that sounds good is that in average from 1819 to 2324, we have campaigns of 6,700 kilos in average. And this, of course, considering the variations among the regions. And the number has not changed that much. 23-24 was probably the campaign in the best shape. And I think that the next campaign, the one that we're going to be harvesting now, is going to be even above 23-24. So what happens when we evaluate campaigns and region? Here we have the south-south region, Bahía Blanca, Central West region, Tres Arroyos to the mountain part, and the southeast. The area near Bahía Blanca, there's stability throughout the 6 campaigns, except for 22-23. In average in the region, they are around 4,200 kilos. Then the one that presents more differences, whether or even with some others similar to the other region. Unfortunately, there were more campaigns more similar to the southern region than the southeast region. And the last campaign of the central and west region was the one that was more similar to the southeast. And the southeast has 8,500 kilos and a lot of stability throughout campaigns. So if you participated in a meteorology presentation, probably you will know how the El Niño is not affecting so much the southeast. So here we know that corn yield equals to the water availability. So we see here how there's stability, and probably the network here fell into good environments, because maybe someone from the city of Loberia can come and tell me, oh no, my corn was terrible during that campaign. But well, yeah, I'm giving you the general concept. So how do we assess hybrids? The environmental index. Here we have 4 hybrids. The 4 of them do not share all the cycles. I mean, they do not share the same sites. There are some with more and some with less, but this is the yield of the hybrid according to the environmental index. And through this, we can make comparisons. Here we have 4 hybrids, one that stood out the most, 2 hybrids that are different, 476 and 7921. They are very different, but they are the average of the environmental index. They are not separated. They go together throughout the entire line, and a hybrid that was below the environmental index. And one of the first things that we see is that there is no interactions when you see these four hybrids.
Un poco los elegí.
Well, I chose them on purpose somehow, because if I do an assessment here, also with a very simple model, by valuing the environmental index simply of the yield values under 8,000 kilos to the values above 8,000 kilos. In that statistical analysis, excuse me if you don't, are not an expert in statistics, but that analysis tells me that the environmental effect is the most important one, as we saw. 70% is environmental impact. 17% is the hybrid impact, but there's an interaction, a significant interaction, very, very poor, very low, but significant. Some hybrids are crossed. And the biggest problem is there in the environment that goes from 6,000 to 9,000 kilos. Of course, this comes hand in hand with differences in the reproductive plasticity of the hybrids, the effects of, the issue of the tiller formation. If they manage to form the spike, that hybrid goes up in the value of the yield. And if the season was inverse, there were no good conditions in the reproductive season, and there was no spike in the tiller, then there's more variable there.
Si hago este mismo análisis estadístico,
If I conduct the same statistical analysis and instead of using the environmental index, I use the regions I showed you before, southeast, central, west, and south-south, then the interaction region and hybrid is not that significant. That is, the interaction is there, but it's not as valuable. The hybrid effect per se is much more important. And I want you to see that in an agronomical characterization that summarizes the work of these 6 years, where we analyze the relative yield. It's just dividing the yield of the hybrid divided by the average yield in that location of that trial. So it's a relative value. For instance, if the hybrid or the average yield was 5,000 kilos and the hybrid had 5.5, then the relative index is 110. The yield was 10% higher than average. So in that way, we manage the changes in yield, and that the fact that the interaction is not significant allows us to see that. And another component that is going to allow us to soften the interaction is what we can see in this table. When you see there, that is not very clear, but we're going to move slowly. We're going to stay with this table for a while to see if we can see it. Do you have a pointer? In this column, we have the hybrids, okay, that have been evaluated. The table continues here on the right. It starts here and it continues there. Here we have the relative yield of each hybrid, the relative position. What I said for the environmental index analysis, this is the same. This hybrid shared some experiments with this one, some with others. That is, not all hybrids are in the same situation. So do not take the data in a very strict way. Be more flexible about it. So in this, in the first colored boxes, we see the relative yield rates, we see the hybrids with a better performance generally. And on the other hand, we see this is decreasing to the hybrids that have the worst performance as part of the data set. So this would be valued by the N. The N is the number of times the hybrid participated. 53. That is, I have 53 strips of this hybrid that are telling me that the relative yield is 9% above the average. 53 strips harvested is a lot of data. This is very strong. But when I have a value of 11, for example, an N of 11, well, that has a lower weight. So there we should give more solvency to the issue. On the other hand, to remove strength from the interaction that I showed you before that was weak, but I wanted to take some strength out of it, we have grouped here the tests, the 46 tests that were done were grouped per yield per plant. Why grouping them by yield per plant? That is segregating them, those with a high yield per plant and low yield per plant. That is to remove this effect of reproductive plasticity in the assessment of the hybrids. This is information that then will also help me decide how to manage it. So I have the first column that is all the different shades, the different colors, is the difference within the column. You shouldn't compare one column to the other. The first column is yield per plant high, that is, plants with more than one tiller. Here there can be tests of low yield that had a very low density, or medium tests that also had low density. Of course, yield per plant high implies low densities. It's equivalent to low densities. Medium yield per plant would be the just one tiller per plant, where the plasticity of the plant should be between 110 grams and 210 grams per plant. That is individual productivity at those levels. And a low yield per plant would be under 110 grams per plant. This is the average of the trial. There are hybrids that are much below this number. Are you following? So this would be equivalent to high density. This situation of 110 grams is not in the southeast region. Why? Because there are high levels, the stability is high, so all the information we have from Balcarce is in this range, so it's absolutely.
Los datos son las zonas nuevas.
These are the new maize growing regions with a yield under 6,000 kilograms. So another thing to consider is when you analyze the table, if I if I average, for instance, yield per plant, low, medium, and high, I'm not going to have the same data as here. The average of these three is not this, because here we have the relative data of all the participations of the hybrids. Okay? So if I take this hybrid, 6620, I manage it in high density, it has a relative index of 95. That is, with this hybrid, with this density, I send it here, back here, the last one. Am I clear? That is the value of this segregation. That tells me, in relative terms, if I manage defensive densities adjusted to a spike, or in a high-stress condition, how each hybrid would behave, always with the same consideration. To the extent that this n is high, this value will have more or less strength. Now then, what did I say at the beginning? This with the interaction, and at the same time, this would give me a value. I mean, if I go with this hybrid, what would be the situation, the most proper density for that hybrid? For instance, if I go with BRV 8380, I don't need to go low defensive densities. I need to adjust the density a little higher. When I adjust the density high, other hybrid come up. Other hybrids are important and come up. So I have a lot to choose from. So basically, that's the idea. But what gravitates here, and I think the most significant thing, and it's what Farmer told me, and I take it because it's true. He told me that hybrid, even if it's for free, it's expensive. If you give it to me for free and I plant it, I will lose money. That happens when I have this kind of material, and in no circumstance, in no management, it will never move up. And basically, it happens in our region because it's a region where the water stress is significantly higher than in other regions. And perhaps these are germoplasms that are not adapted to that stress shock that is intermittent, that perhaps is stuck. So the most relevant thing here is to know what hybrid I should not be planting, okay? Then when I have a set of hybrids, I should find the management according to a situation where the hybrid will be fine. It's difficult to take a new hybrid, use it just for 1 year, and then make a strong conclusion. So to obtain this, we have to follow this number, the N number. And to round up, I think that the information from the Aapresid network have been very important. When I have to analyze the network, I see very few data that are outsiders. I mean, most of the data are very well aligned. They have a big value, very precise. And that has to do with the quality of the people that are running the tests. I see many of you here, and they have such a commitment to managing, to doing that test and to doing it right. So congratulations. I want to finish by congratulating them because the information is very, very good. And very soon, as soon as we have the data for the next season, we will be sharing them. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will ask the first question about this, and also about the weight of the N, as you said, to make the decisions as to what to plant and what not in terms of the materials. And when we said, well, depending on the environment where we are, in the south, a more defensive strategy, and the environment ends up being better than we thought, how much we lose or how much we can play with the reproductive plasticity that you mentioned so as not to lose so much. Well, there's a variable that we don't manage so much, and that is the tiller formation. The impact of the tiller formation is very important when we use low densities. Below 40,000 plants, the tiller starts to have an important relative importance. In 20,000 plants, sometimes it contributes 50% of what the hybrid produces. I know that somebody says that the tiller is a headache. Yeah, but 90% of the hybrids form tillers, and sometimes they form tillers and there's nothing to do about it. Now, and then as Lina mentioned, the season came, the rainfall, everything as happened with the last season. I don't know that many farmers will be at a yield, many of you will be at a yield of 7,000 kilograms, which is not bad for the region. It's a lot. Now, if that farmer had improved the nitrogen, many tillers, instead of 7, they should have produced 10,000. Of course, we have to manage the costs and we have to manage the circumstances, but some aspects are essential. Sometimes the environment doesn't have them. Water, I have to, well, follow that and think it's relevant. And as to the N, to know if hybrid works or not, the good hybrids are obvious immediately. Of course, you have to run tests, and achieving that, visiting the tests, seeing them personally. Sometimes we do the meetings for the tests in the one that is doing better, and perhaps we shouldn't do it. I think the farmer should agree to show them. That is the challenge we have. And as you said, I will start with what you said, that sometimes the data that we analyze in the network are managed by the farmer, basically the nitrogen doses, and we don't see other things that the farmers could have explored in the environment with the proper rainfall. And we don't do it with nitrogen because they have an economical perspective. They don't try to explore the maximum yields, but the economic yields. That's the data from the network.
Yeah, and also there's a master's thesis with data from the network on fertilization that we're going to be sharing in our next publication, which will be soon after all the harvesting of the tests. And also I would like to highlight the importance of having holistic analysis. It's not just the picture of the campaign for new materials, so that we can really recommend more hybrids. What do you think about that? Is that a challenge to increase the number of materials used in the area in terms of genetics? Well, this comment is very valuable because you might think that there are 3 or 4 winners and that's it. But sometimes it is the turn of one hybrid or the other. There are changes in the weather and conditions, and then some hybrids become stronger, or some others are good in the reproductive stage with a good grain weight, or when it started raining by the end of the campaign, like in the last one, those hybrid got a plus. Or sometimes it rains at the beginning and all the early hybrids are in an advantage situation compared to the late hybrids. So what do I mean by this? It's not just 2 or 3 hybrids. We need to try and open the range as the surface allows it. I always need to try to diversify, and in this, the assessment and test of materials is paramount. And this is a repetition, because every year we try and see what happened and what were the results. And sometimes we exaggerate in the hybrid gaps because we do have nets that show, okay, with this one you can get 3,000 more kilos, and that's a lie. Maybe it did happen, but the genetic gaps in all networks for all species are between 10 and 15%. And in this region particularly, the genetic aspect is more important because the stress is much more relevant than in other regions. If we have the same set of hybrids, and if we go to the center of the country, the gap will be 10 or even 9%. We have a microphone for questions, and they're asking here about the soil of the southeast. what happens there with the variable doses, how to play around with nitrogen, nutrition. Well, there are some sites where we conducted tests in those plots, and we respect the recommendation of the expert offering advice to that plot. There are plots that have the dosage correction because of the potential, and those are environments that are included in the test. Well, I don't know whether you have any questions. I don't see anyone raising their hands, but it would be good for us to keep on analyzing the data set of the network, to keep on adding more ears so that we can have stronger and stronger messages. And with more N, that table will grow. And we invite you, if you want to have sites for essays and tests and companies who would like to join the project, the doors are open for you to join us. Thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you to the participants for your time. The publication of the network will be ready after the Congress. Thank you.